Welcome back, my friends, to my channel and to another creative video. Spring is in full swing over here, and I am working and creating with all things floral behind the scenes. And I've got a fun little process video for you all of how I like to combine different materials on a surface working with florals. Now, if you're interested in diving into the theme of florals, I actually just launched a brand new class called Floral Petite, which starts later this month on April 22nd. It is 30 days of small prompts each day dedicated to exploring different types of flowers with different materials, mediums, and techniques. This is a fun way to get your feet wet if you are wanting to explore drawing, painting, and creating with the theme of flowers. But for today's video, I wanted to give you a peek behind my own process of really playing around with a lot of different materials on one surface. If you watch my videos here on my channel or even take my art classes that I offer, you will know that I absolutely love finding creative ways to use a variety of different materials and techniques within one surface. I really love the concept of layering, whether I am using acrylic paint or colored pencils or playing around with watercolors. I like to really challenge myself to see if I can incorporate a variety of layers as well as challenge myself to use different tools, supplies, and materials. So this particular surface, I am working on one of what I call my whimsical illustrative bouquets. I really enjoy utilizing something like a still life as the beginning of my inspiration and then putting my own twist on the concept and how I end up adding color and lines and details. For this particular surface, I wanted to use a combination of watercolors, colored pencils, alcohol ink pens, and then just my favorite black pens for drawing and adding line work. And the way that I often do this is by always starting with a good light wash of watercolors. In a lot of my creative surfaces, I really enjoy using watercolors for the beginning of any color that I add. I think for me, I like being able to control the saturation, so I can do a light, colorful wash and leave it light enough so I can layer over the top of it with more saturation and color. My goal is to give myself a good starting point with color to kind of get my color mapped out, get it added to some of the shapes and the areas on that surface. And then once that first layer dries, I can always go back in and really amp up that color, start outlining things and adding my own illustrative style and touch to that surface. And I'm actually working on a piece of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. I really enjoy the brand Canson. It is just a nice, good middle of the road for me to play and practice on. It takes all kinds of different wet media really, really well. Now for the next step, I'm going back in and adding some darker saturated color with my alcohol ink markers. I actually have been really enjoying combining markers, colored pencils, and my watercolors. I really enjoy that light wash of color, but then pulling out my different materials to add more saturation over the top. And so once my surface is dry, I will go in and start adding darker areas to that watercolor wash. Often I am working from my own style, so I have sketched out my flowers, and they are a nice combination between illustrative and then trying to capture my inspiration in somewhat of a representational way. I really like going whimsical with my own style and approach, so I go pretty bold when it comes to contrast and color. I'm not really looking to capture things in a realistic way. I'm simply looking to capture them in a way that feels right for me and my style. And this is what I really enjoy, is really playing with color, really playing with light and dark, and seeing how far I can maybe even amp it up here and there. I also really love incorporating pattern and surface design within my surfaces. So while I love flowers, I love finding a good excuse to incorporate some sort of repeat pattern or mark making. And if you're creating some sort of a still life, if you're creating a bouquet that's in a vase or on a table or in some sort of a setting, it is the perfect excuse to incorporate additional pattern and surface design into that surface. So for this particular composition, composition. I am playing with my vase being on top of a table with maybe some sort of an interesting tablecloth, just giving myself the excuse to play around with brushwork and designs. You'll notice that I've got that nice light blue wash, and then I'm using my brush this time around to go in and add all those tiny details. I like that push and pull between light and dark. That wash gives you that first nice layer, and then you can always go back in with darker, more saturated details, designs, however you're painting or whatever you're painting. You can really play with light and dark, whether you are just using watercolors or if you're playing with different materials on that surface. I find in my own work that really staying aware and being intentional about light and dark, about contrast or the color choices you have, can really amplify even a simple image or design. And so, while a lot of the things on this surface are quite simple, because I have made color choices, because I have really intentionally decided to go light and dark with layering things, starting out with that wash and then going in with some darker colors with those markers, colored pencils, or even more saturated watercolor paint, I instantly add this push and pull within that surface. My own style and process really is often about line work. I am somebody that is going to probably end up outlining anything and everything when I am drawing, painting, or creating. It's just built into my style and it's what I enjoy doing the most. You will see how this particular surface completely transforms just by taking it a step further by outlining things. Now, I love my good old trusty extra fine point for this process, and for me, it is really just about outlining, tracing around my brushwork or any of my lines that I've already added with color. I actually really enjoy outlining kind of wonky, weird brush strokes or edges. I'm not always looking for things to be perfect, straight, crisp, or clean. In fact, if I can get a little bit expressive, I'm going to do that in a surface like this and in an approach like this. Often I will have wobbly lines or lines that have a lot of expression, and I will make sure that there's some movement in my approach when I'm outlining and adding all my line work. A surface like this for me is really playful, it's very whimsical, and it's all about playing around with lines, color, and contrast. And so even my outlining process, even the process of adding more details here and there, is actually quite expressive. And I love finding this back and forth between maybe outlining something, going back over it with some darker color here and there, then going back in with my black pen and outlining a little bit more. And my goal when I work this way is to keep my hand moving. I like expression a lot when I am drawing in this way. And so I like to have a lot of expressive marks. If I pull in additional color, you will notice it's a little bit scribbly, it's a little bit messy, and that's what I'm going for in my approach with this type of a surface. When I'm using a variety of different supplies on one surface, when I'm using watercolors, colored pencils, markers, and pens, I really like to play around with them in different ways. So I will maybe outline and darken some lines here and there. Other lines I will let be light and airy and fine. I will maybe grab my marker and go in with a really dark, bold area just to amp things up a little bit. And then I might maybe use the edge of my colored pencil to lightly shade a small edge of my flower or to add details in a smaller way or in a smaller place. What's really fun about combining materials is that it gives you the ability to layer a lot on one surface. I really enjoy limiting my supplies, maybe just working with watercolors or just working with colored pencils. I find when you get creative and push yourself to maybe play around with ways you can use different materials all together, things can get really interesting and really creative. And I find when I'm working this way, I can capture color in an interesting wash in a very light, airy way that I did with watercolors, but I can also, over the top of things, capture a lot of expression in the way that I might add details or color with more of my expressive drawing and sketching over the top of that watercolor. And while there is no right or wrong way to combine supplies or layer them up, I always like to recommend experimenting a little bit before you commit. There are some supplies that work really well together if you are working in layers. For example, watercolors work really well with colored pencils over the top. They also work really well with any kind of a permanent marker that's not going to bleed or blend on that surface. Other supplies might not work so great together, and it's always wonderful to give yourself permission to play around and experiment and see what works for you. These few supplies I've really been enjoying in my own creative process over here behind the scenes. It's been a fun way to combine some of the best of both worlds when it comes to those materials. Really being able to pull out my paint and a brush and get expressive and colorful with those washes, but then playing around over the top of that color with those details, getting expressive with my sketching, and really seeing how far I can push those supplies in interesting ways. So I'm going to let y'all watch me finish up this surface and really just continue to work back and forth with those different supplies. Grab a pencil to add details, then grab a marker to add a little bit more saturation, pull out my pen to outline things, and rinse, repeat over and over again until I have finished this surface. I'm hoping that this video inspires you to maybe pull out a few different materials and combine them on one surface, or maybe even play around with those layers of different materials within your artwork.